Welcome to a new episode of my Dear Kitchen in Helsinki podcast. My guest today in this first episode of 2021 is Daria Krivonos from University of Helsinki. Daria and I talked about the need for migrant farm workers in the EU and Finland, their working conditions, what COVID-19 situation revealed, and where intervention is needed. You can read Daria's article about this topic titled Ukrainian Farm Workers and Finland's Regular Army of Labor on raster.fi. I hope that our discussion increases your interest on this crucial topic. As always, special thanks to my dear friend Ufuk Evcimen for the sound editing. All right. Hello, Daria. And
Hi.
Thank you for accepting to do this interview. This is a very special episode for me because up until this point, all the previous episodes that I did with different guests, I knew the topic more or less up to a certain depth, especially food sovereignty I'm working on myself.
Mm-hmm.
But this topic I myself have been just reading and my interest, of course, got increased last spring with the COVID situation. So this is going to be very informative for me as well. And I hope it's going to open new discussions with the listeners too. But before we dive into the topic, can you introduce yourself a little, your academic background, your current research, which is a bit different than the topic, today's topic, but also your interest in today's topic?
Yes. Well, thank you so much for the invitation. First of all, I'm really delighted to be here. And I'm really happy to be part of this podcast series. And I myself learned a lot from your podcast. I listened to other episodes and I really, really learned a lot about food sovereignty, for example.
Oh, that's great.
Yes. So I'm a sociologist based in the University of Helsinki, and I'm interested in the questions of migration, labor, and racialization. So these are my main research interests. So I'm interested in the production of difference among laboring populations and the ways migration status or processes of racialization, that is the production of difference, intersects with people's labor market positions and the ways these processes produce people's labor market positions.
Mm.
So my PhD was about young Russian-speaking migrants living in Helsinki and their labor trajectories and experiences of racism. I did interviews with these young people, but I also did observations in the employment offices, in welfare centers and integration courses. For example, I have written about how young Russian-speaking migrants are racialized. That is, they are seen as different from Finnish population, and how this production of difference leads them to take labor market positions below their skills and qualifications.
Mm-hmm.
So I defended my PhD in 2019, and I'm currently a postdoc in the University of Helsinki again, and my project explores Ukrainian labor migration to Poland. Because I'm interested in that because Ukraine offers a major supply of labor to the European Union, and Poland is the country that issues the highest number of work visas in the European Union. So in 2019, only 600,000 first residence permits based on work were issued by Poland, and they mainly went to Ukrainian workers. So it's a very under-researched area and geography in the European Union. So I really wanted to go there.
Mm-hmm.
And I did go there last spring. I managed to do some interviews with young Ukrainian workers. But then because of the coronavirus situation, I had to come back to Finland very quickly because the borders were closing.
Yeah.
And I myself learned about that through the news. So I had to change my ticket 2 times during one day. I had to come back to Finland. And then all the discussion around borders has started in Finland. So the borders had to be closed to prevent the spread of the coronavirus infection. But then the discussion started also who the borders should remain open for. Especially it was connected to the discussion around labor and migrant workers and the discussion around agriculture and food supply. So suddenly all the discourse around migration changed towards migrant workers as being key actors who would now secure the supply of food. And if you could check, for example, the Border Patrol's website, Raja, you would see that they listed the categories of people who could cross the borders during that time. And among diplomats, so these are kind of the winners of globalization, the people for whom the borders are always open. These were also migrant workers for whom the borders had to remain open. So I thought that was a very interesting situation. And the other interesting thing is that the whole discourse around migrant labor and the borders was framed in terms of security, but not as we are typically used to kind of a lot of migration discourses associate migration with a security threat, but now migrant workers would be the key actors which would protect the security of food in Finland. So the discourse has really changed very quickly. And I thought that was a very interesting situation when the borders had to remain open for migrant workers, which also then shows that borders never remain completely sealed for migrants because we are so much dependent on migrant labor. So this is the story of how I became interested in this topic, and of course, it was about the Ukrainian migration that everybody was talking about in relation to agricultural work. That because the borders were closed, Finland couldn't get access to Ukrainian agricultural workers that used to come to Finland every year to do agricultural and farming work. Yes, then they introduced the quotas, first 10,000 people and then more, that we have to get these people to keep our food security in order. So the story is that I'm not really like food and agricultural work is not my field of expertise, but it's a bit of a spin-off of my research interests. So at that time, I decided to contact some of the Ukrainian workers who came to Finland.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about that very much in details. I want to get into that. But before that, I want to just first frame the discussion a bit in a general format, like why is there a need for migrant farm workers around Europe? And you talked about Ukraine and Poland giving visas, but in general, which are generally the receiving countries and which are the countries that send the workers? Is there this kind of clear separation?
Yeah, so the main thing is that there is a downward price pressure and competition between producers of food, which means that the producers and growers use all possible means to cut the costs, such as dependence on low wages. And we know from previous research that a lot of agricultural workers have irregular or insecure migrant status, and they are often undocumented, or they are recruited as seasonal workers with visas that allow them to remain in the country only during the harvest period, or they don't allow them to change the labor sectors, or they don't allow them to change the employer. So this kind of structural condition of dependency on employment and the situation of illegality or extreme precariousness of this migrant workforce allows precisely to depress the wages and keep laborers kind of disenfranchised.
Yeah.
But if we look into top agri-food producers and exporters, such as Germany, Spain, the Netherlands, for example, the Netherlands, 7% of GDP comes from export of vegetables and flowers. So all these countries, and along with other European countries, they're really dependent on migrant labor. Most of this of the workforce employed in agricultural work comes from migrant workforce, up to like 90% in certain cases. And mainly these are the workers coming from Eastern Europe, Romania, and Bulgaria, kind of the quite popular countries, also Ukraine. So these are the sending countries, at least in the European Union. And the other reason why there is such a dependence on migrant labor is that quite often the national workforce is protected by the welfare state, which increases the bargaining power of workers. So it means that they can rather receive the unemployment benefits, for example, rather than going to do full-time work, which is really, really difficult. Like agricultural work is one of the most dangerous types of work, the most exploited types of work. So the national population is protected by the welfare state, while the people coming from Romania and Bulgaria after the socialist welfare states have collapsed. These people have no other means but to sell their labor power and to migrate to the countries with higher wages, and labor migration becomes their means of subsistence.
Now, I found you through your article on raster.fi, which is anti-racism research network, and it was about the Ukrainian workers. And we're going to talk about that in a minute, but I just want to first ask you about something which also appears in the title as well. So you talk about reserve army of labor and regular army of labor. Now, can you explain these a little? And then we're going to continue with the working conditions later.
Yes. I take these terms from Sarafari's work, that's his Marxist feminist scholar that focuses on care work and migrant care work, but Sarafaris takes these terms from Marx. So the term reserve army of labor means surplus population of the unemployed or underemployed people. So this all the people who are unemployed. So and unemployment, those people who do research on labor, they know that unemployment is a structural feature of capitalist economies which allows to keep the wages down. So because there are just so many people who are ready to do this work, allows the capitalists to put the wages down. So when we talk about reserve army of labor, it means that these people are taken out of this reserve, of this pool of labor during the times of need and high production, and laid off when there is no longer need for their labor. Migrant workers represent this high share of the reserve army of labor. So they are last hired and first fired, kind of this type of logic. But then Sarah Faris observed in her research on migrant care workers during the time of global financial crisis that the sectors of care and health work, which are the highest employers of migrant women workers, haven't been affected by the global economic crisis and instead have been even expanded. But kind of their idea of the reserve army of labor is that during the time of crisis, there is no need for this labor anymore. So you can easily fire these people, get rid of them. But as I said, that then Sarah Faris noticed that there is a constant demand for care workers and health workers, regardless of the time of crisis. So there is always the need for these workers. And so she says that this is not a reserve army of labor, but the regular army of labor. These are the people, the laboring populations that are always occupying these labor sectors. regardless, is it the time of crisis or not, because there is a constant demand for this type of workers. So then I was just thinking that, and observing this whole coronavirus situation, that despite the economic downturns of this crisis and the growing unemployment rates, there is a continuous and urgent shortage of labor in the sectors such as agriculture that sustain our everyday lives, such as, for example, seasonal work. And Marxist feminist scholars use this term life-making labor. So they say that this is the labor that we need to sustain our day-to-day lives. So we always need this labor because we need to stay alive. So I was just drawing some parallels with this previous research and thinking that migrant workers are this regular army of labor in the Finnish agricultural sector, because even during the time of crisis and closed borders, there was little possibility to recruit national workers to do this kind of work.
Well, yeah. So now moving on to the working conditions itself. I want to first talk in general about EU and then come to Finland specifically. So, and you talked a little bit about especially the situation, we talked about the reason why they come and things like that. But when we talk about their actual working conditions, what is those conditions generally for migrant farm workers in EU, and what differs between different countries, if there are such differences? And also maybe you can already say a little bit about what COVID-19 specifically revealed about these conditions.
Yes, so agriculture is one of the top risk sectors for unfair work. And the problem is that quite often it remains invisible for the public eye. And I myself encountered this situation, for example, when I was in Poland, but also like here in Finland, sometimes getting access to these farms, and which are situated far away from the places where we live as researchers or as activists. These places are quite often difficult to reach. And this is why some topics in migration research are over-researched, because it's so easy to get access to those places because of this infrastructure. And my colleague from Elisa Pascucci from University of Helsinki wrote about this question of over-research. I just moved away from the question. But so the point is that it's sometimes quite difficult to get access to those places. And despite the talk about the mechanization of our economies, hands and arms of workers, of agricultural workers, remain the most reliable tools for picking. And actually research shows that it's more expensive to introduce these mechanical tools and all the equipment to agriculture. It's more expensive rather than employing migrant workers. So, as I said, this is a very labor-intensive working conditions because everything is picked by hand. It's a very demanding and monotonous form of work. Outdoors work has to be done outside, regardless of weather conditions. And one of the things is that people told me that they have to bring a lot of clothes with them from Ukraine, for instance. And this is why they prefer to come by buses, because there is no any limitation to how much weight you can bring, because you have to bring really different types of clothes, because sometimes people stay for 6 months and the weather conditions change throughout the year, as we know. Then this is a physically demanding work that comes with health hazards because of the exposure to chemicals in greenhouses. And that there is this need for temporal flexibility among workers. But then I don't know if we want to move to what my interviewees told me about their working conditions in Finland.
Yes,
But
sure.
but
You interviewed the Ukrainian workers who were coming or planning to come, at least.
yes, or who already had the experience of coming to Finland earlier. So it's quite interesting that the whole kind of conversation was framed around this issue of luck, of how lucky or unlucky they were with their employers, which means that there is a really high dependency on employers in this sector, because these are employers that issue the visas, and which makes workers highly dependent on their employers, because then you can't change the employer or you can't change the labor sector. These are also the employers that quite often provide the housing, which means that you're also dependent on employer in terms of housing. So these are really asymmetrical power relations which are produced by immigration control, and the fact that the citizenship status of these people is called a migrant, which means that they're staying in the country depends on the employers. And if you leave the employer, you can be deported. And this is why a lot of people talked rather carefully about their employment conditions, because they would fear that they could be fired or not recruited again the following year if they complain too much about their work employers. But then the structuring feature is that this is the labor sector with very low pay. In Finland, the pay is 8.57 euros per hour, so 8.5 euros per hour. But in practice, people told me that they are receiving even less money, because some of the money, some sum of money can be deducted from their wages, and this money goes to employment agencies. And this is something that I learned as well about the hiring agencies, but actually other research shows that the agricultural sector operates through subcontractors and hiring agencies to which workers have to pay in order to get a job.
Okay.
Yes, so workers can pay starting from 300 euros to 1,000 euros to come to Finland to work. So they're paying for the possibility to come to Finland to work. And this is because apparently it's the connection between the employer and the workers, like the farmer and the workers, is not very stable. I think quite often we tend to think about these flows of migrant labor, that it's just so easy, that there is a high demand and there is a high supply of labor. But in practice, there is a need for these intermediaries, which are then this role is taken by private agencies who make profit out of that. And this leads to a situation when there is not only that these companies make profit out of that, but also there are fake hiring agencies which just take money from the people but don't provide any employment contracts.
So are these agencies, middle agencies, are they in their original country of living? And I mean, is there any regulation on these agencies?
So these companies are based in Ukraine. And for example, one person told me that he comes from a city of 200,000 people. And he said that there are 10 small agencies and 2 big agencies that hire workers only to Finland.
Okay.
I think that's quite striking.
Yeah.
Yes, so I was also about to say about the frauds and the fact that there are these fake hiring companies that just take money from the people but don't give any employment contracts. And I was also contacted by some people who then asked me to check if the employment contract is correct. And then I would call the farmer, which was written in the employment contract, But then the farmer said that I never issued this contract to these people. And that was a really, in a way, kind of, to me, I felt it was a very surrealistic situation that kind of I just called the worker and I'm now calling the farmer. What's the problem kind of connecting these two people together? But apparently it's not so easy to connect. And this idea of this supply chain of labor, it's very fragile. And there is really a need of connection and very transparent connection between the workers and the farmers, so that the workers wouldn't get into these situations when they spend really big sums of money to these fake employment agencies. So this person, he had the experience of 3 frauds. So he wasted like 900 euros together with his friends while trying to get to Finland as a worker.
Can they make how to say, like, is there any channel that they can report these issues? I mean, is there anything being made about these frauds, or are they also not so much? Are they maybe scared to follow up on that? I mean,
officially in Finland, it's illegal to use these kind of agencies, but I think there is evidence of the farmers also using these kind of agencies when recruiting workers. But these companies operate in Ukraine, and I just don't know. I asked my lawyer friends how does it work, but they said that from the perspective of Finland, it's a very tricky situation, and there is little way to influence this situation because it takes place in Ukraine. Well, but the fact is that Finland still profits from this kind of illegal arrangements, because all the costs of getting information and getting connecting to the farmers through so many mistakes, these costs are taken by the workers themselves. Yes, so this hiring agencies is apparently quite a widely spread issue, not only in Finland, but also in other countries. But then the people also told me that there are different ways to downgrade the salaries of the workers. And the working hours are really unregulated in those instances. For example, one person told me that if he worked 200 hours a month, for which he was paid 6 euros per hour, which is lower than the official wage, and he would earn 1,200 euros a month. But then the farmer would divide 1,200 euros by the official hourly wage of 8.5 euros. And then it turns out that he only worked 140 hours. And on papers, it's all correct and nice, but because it's so much regulated by this informal relations between the farmer and the worker, that it can get really tricky. But then there are also different kind of little thefts, which these people also told me about, that during the harvest season, workers are paid by kilos of the fruit, or like mainly berries that they collected, or by boxes, and the box is supposed to be 3 kilos. So you're paid by box. But they said that the full boxes can be heavier than 3 kilos. So there are always these kind of small instances of depressed wages of people.
But then, of course, I mean, these are the ongoing conditions in general. But how about, especially, I mean, when we talk about the pandemic situation during COVID-19, there's also the health-related questions. I mean, we all, during the spring, we were all in our homes, if you can, trying to work from home if you can. But these are, I mean, in a farm, so many people are working together, And how about during the pandemic, their health situation was secured, or was it secured? How was it like that? And also, if they got sick with the COVID, I mean, do they have any kind of healthcare possibility? For example, here in Finland, an Ukrainian worker.
But in general, if you come as a seasonal worker, you're supposed to pay your own health insurance. So you're paying your own private health insurance. And quite often we know, well, I mean, if you traveled as a non-EU citizen somewhere, quite often it turns out that this insurance doesn't cover practically anything. And from previous research, we also know that when the worker gets ill, their strategy is to go to the employer and ask for help from the employer. So people don't go to the medical institutions because, I mean, also those places are in such remote areas, and even for transportation, they can be dependent on the farmers. So this is not like a very independent situation that you can just take your car and go see a doctor. So that's a general condition, that you should have your own private health insurance, which also is the same for students in Finland. So we have this idea of Finland of a universalist welfare state, but in case of the seasonal workers, they're not protected by the Finnish welfare state. But then when I asked them about all these regulations regarding the quarantine, people just said that there is no time to wait, because the season is coming and you can't just wait 2 weeks of quarantine, and then you are not paid for these 2 weeks while waiting for the right time to start. I didn't get, I hope nobody got ill among the people which I interviewed, but we know from other cases in Romania, for example, there were protests among farm workers who demanded better and safer conditions regarding their health, because people were contracted coronavirus in those situations. And also people live together, they don't have private spaces. So it's a really risky situation that the virus can be easily contracted. Yeah. But I was also observing this whole discourse in the European Union regarding the health and safety. It was mainly the safety of the national population. The discourse was that, well, we should make sure that these people don't bring coronavirus to our countries, while there was much less discussion about how can we ensure that these people have safe working conditions and are protected.
Yeah. So talking about all these working conditions and the need and all, what does this all tell you about labor and movements within the EU? As a summary? Or...
Well, I mean, I would just like to pinpoint that there is this structural reliance on migrant labor in certain sectors. And quite often it's precisely the migrant status of these people, which I explained to you, that because they're dependent on their visas, they're dependent on their employers. This is why they're structurally forced to accept certain working conditions, and they're not part of the labor unions, they're not part of the welfare state. So people are on their own, together with their informal networks and their own kind of means to protest and to demand better employment conditions. But also the whole idea, even if we talk about labor mobility within the EU, that labor exploitation becomes possible through inequalities that exist within the European Union itself. The idea that you can extract labor from poorer countries, the countries which have poor levels of wages, for example.
And I was going to ask before, but I skipped. But actually, especially during the COVID-19 crisis, these migrant farm workers' identification in some cases, and there were some articles discussing that, from unskilled to critical workers. So, for example, I mean, what does this tell again about labor and all these workers?
Yeah, this is absolutely true that the whole discourse of skills was turned upside down during the COVID-19 pandemic. So we suddenly started talking about all these workers that sustain life. And again, I'm referring to this term by a scholar, Titi Bhattacharya, life-making labor. I mean, all this labor we need to sustain our everyday lives and lives in general. But quite often these jobs are labeled as low-skilled. But we also know from research that the whole distinction between highly skilled and low-skilled was always used to legitimize wage inequalities. And as feminist scholars would say that quite often the jobs which are done by racialized workers, by non-white workers and female workers, they are devalued because social reproduction means that the reproduction of our everyday lives, all the labor and effort that is needed to reproduce our everyday lives, such as having food on the table or like somebody needs to cook this food, all this labor is devalued because social reproduction is devalued. So this low-skilled or unskilled labor has been brought to the center of the discussion during COVID-19 pandemic. And this is exactly true that we can easily maybe survive without so-called bullshit jobs. This is the term by David Graeber. And I saw a lot of discussion that we can certainly survive without some marketing people. And I mean, I don't have anything against this, but just the pandemic situation showed that what we really need is this labor to make our lives possible. And the fact that this labor is often labeled as unskilled or low-skilled allows to put the wages down among these workers. And this is why suddenly all the discussion started that, we have to increase the wages of these people. These workers are our heroes. And here we are, just, a bit more than half a year later, we're completely forgotten about this discussion.
Now, the next question, well, you are not an expert on food or food security yourself, but I still wish to hear your opinion. This reliance on migrant farm workers, what does it tell you about food security? And if you want to also, if now that you said you learned a little bit about food sovereignty, what does it tell you about food security and sovereignty in EU?
Well, yeah, as you noted correctly, I'm not the expert on food security. I think there are certainly better researchers who can talk about that. But from my perspective, is that we should talk about who bears the costs and who provides, who guarantees this food security. Because quite often, I forgot to tell you that to pay for this hiring agencies and to pay for the travel to get to Finland, because these workers pay their housing and travel to Finland themselves, they acquire debt, which they pay with the salaries that they then get in Finland. So this is a really kind of a vicious circle. So the point about food security is that really who bears the costs of this food security, and we can see that quite often these are the migrant workers themselves who provide this food security. But also I think that the example of these hiring agencies, it just shows how fragile these supply chains are, supply chains of labor, that it's not this kind of idea of a flowing labor, that the labor just comes here. I mean, that the fact that these intermediary companies exist, it shows that it's not so easy. And so the fragility of the supply chains, which I would like also to highlight, that our food security relies on these very fragile supply chains. But also there is another example related to COVID-19 pandemic is this feminist scholar Minha Pham. She writes about face mask production during the COVID-19 pandemic, and she says that it's only a couple of places in the world that produce personal protective equipment, and this labor is done by non-white women in is done by non-white women, and kind of the whole global supply of this personal protective equipment comes from really a couple of places in the world, and it is done by non-white women. So the point is that how we really rely on these very fragile supply chains.
Yeah, and there's always, especially when it comes to young people, we think, oh, the young people or the kids don't know where their food is coming from these days. But actually, we also, I mean, we adults don't know most of the time where our food is coming from, or even how our food is coming to our supermarkets. And I think many people know that, yeah, there are people coming, these migrant workers coming and doing some job, but there's always the idea, well, it's happening. I mean, details are not known, but I think just like how it attracted my attention, I'm hoping that it also attracted, thanks to many articles in many different newspapers, what COVID-19 put on surface was now known by a bit bigger audience. But it also now connects this to my next question, which is, now when the borders were closed, and will these workers be able to come or not? But there is work already to be done in the fields in Finland, and there have been calls or ads to people in Finland maybe to come and work. Although, as you said, I mean, there was a discussion about hiring completely unrelated people and then spending all the time first to educate them or train them on this. There was all these discussions, but I've seen some of the, seasonal work ads, and there are all these happy white people working clean in a field, like, oh, this is so beautiful and so happy. Like, I found myself working in this field. Now, and then there's the reality, not just, there's a reality of working in a farm. I went to Lassila farm in Tuusula, who's working with Omama Food Co-op several times. It is hard work. It's not like, hello, this is so nice. It is nice for me. I love doing a little bit myself, but it is hard work. But then there's also all these other working condition reality of the farm workers, the migrant farm workers. So what do you think about this clean, lovely, peaceful image versus reality?
Yeah, well, as you said, it's quite straightforward difference between the image and the reality. And for a long time, picking strawberries, for example, was done in Finland by working class populations, or students would use it as summer jobs. But then with the increase of the standards of life, and it just became also cheaper to hire workers from other countries. But the point is that the people told me that they earn 1,000 euros a month. Their salary is 1,000 euros a month. I mean, how can you survive with this money if you live in Finland? And this can only exist because these people are not living in Finland, because nobody would be able to survive with this sum of money living in Helsinki, paying your own rent and these kind of things. But also if you check the job advertisements of job placements of strawberry picking, for example, I mean, you have to live in the farm. So you have to leave your home, and you have to leave your family, and you have to spend several months or a couple of months living in a different area. So we should also, I think we should ask who bears the costs of the social reproduction and the fact that people leave their families and they leave their children in their home countries. We should ask who takes care of these people there, and the fact that people don't see their families for several months, a year, while they're working for a different country.
You were saying, when you were talking about your interviews with the Ukrainian workers, that, for example, some of them was a bit reluctant to tell very openly everything because, they were maybe scared of losing their job or the possibility of coming back. So then, how are there any channels that these migrant farm workers can use to ask for help or for the improvement of their conditions? Are there any, do they have any collectives that are trying to work on these issues, or are they just, it's so how can I say, vital that they keep the job that they are not even asking at all improvement?
Yeah, well, despite everything I said, I didn't want to make this image of these workers as this kind of victims or voiceless people. Apparently, we know that these workers can confront their employers, and one person told me that he actually confronted the farmer regarding the poor working conditions. Well, but then I don't know much about that, but I just wonder about the role of the trade unions in Finland and how much they're willing to protect the labor force which is not situated in Finland. So I think we really need to ask these structural circumstances that can make it more difficult for people to make complaints. But there are other examples, as I mentioned earlier. In May, in Bonn, in Germany, Romanian workers were striking and demanding better working conditions and better health conditions because they got coronavirus, and there were even some deaths in the meat industry in Germany among Romanian workers. So there is some organizing going on.
So to now summarize and finalize the discussion, my final question about, now we analyzed, we talked in details on working conditions, reasons, COVID-19 general. Then to move forward, to do this, to make it better, to improve, what kind of interventions do you think can be made in the working conditions of the migrant workers, but in labor and movement in general within the EU?
Well, when I asked the workers themselves and I asked them what changes they would like to see, they just told me that they wanted the laws to be respected. So their demand was very, very basic in a way, that they just wanted the laws to be respected, which means that being paid the salary which is promised to them, at least €8.50, then to have coffee breaks every 2 hours, and to being paid overtime, because quite often the workers are not being paid overtime if they're paid by hour. But also, I would say that the seasonal certificates, I forgot to tell you about seasonal certificates, that if you want to come as a seasonal worker in Finland, you have to pay like a really big sums of money to get a certificate. Yes, I just opened this. So the electronic application for the first residence permit is €410, and the paper application is €600. So this is the residence permit for seasonal work. It's if you're going to work for more than 3 months, you have to pay this amount of money to get this certificate. So yeah, the prices for residence permits are also very high, but also I think it's very important that we talk about the transparency through the supply chain. So there have to be really transparent and standardized recruitment processes that I think the country that hires this labor has to be responsible for the recruitment procedures, so that these procedures are not taken by these private recruitment agencies or by these fake agencies at all. But in general, this agricultural sector and labor in the agricultural sector, because it's one of the most dangerous labor sectors, it's closely connected with migration policies in general, and people with irregular status or insecure status will always be more vulnerable to exploitative working conditions, because they don't have access to other jobs, or they can't complain because they will be taken to the police, for instance. So if migration policies will continue to produce undocumented populations or populations with irregular status, exploitation in the labor market will continue. And this is nothing new. It's a really well-documented connection between insecure status of migrants, their dependence on visas, and this connection with poor working conditions.
Well, yeah, this was very, as I said in the beginning, very interesting discussion for me. I mean, I even though you said already in the beginning that this specific topic is not your research, but you already, for me, gave me so much more to continue also to make research, and I hope our listeners also got this info and now are more interested in finding out, and hopefully, even if they are not working themselves in this in anything related to food, we are all eating that food that people are finding hard to work on. So hopefully some kind of collective action, and from the people, from the consumers at least themselves. I mean, if they also push a little bit about all these issues that make it happen to eat that food, then I think it's going to be even more possible maybe to improve the conditions. But these are all my questions for today. Do you have any final words, any final comments?
Well, my point would be that we should really think about who bears the costs of food security, and this kind of problematic distinction between low-skilled jobs and highly skilled jobs, because what we can really learn from this pandemic is that quite often these jobs which are deemed low-skilled are really integral to our survival as a community, as a society. So I think that this pandemic really, we can learn a lot of lessons about what kind of jobs are really deemed necessary. Well, and yes, and it's also the good point to think about migration policies and how migration policies can structurally produce these dependence of workers on their employers. And this is exactly that allows to push the wages down among these workers and allow competition among food producers, and the fact that we can buy food in the stores at lower prices.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you again one more time.
Thank you.
And good luck with your research. And I hope you can find more time to also specifically do more about this, specifically farm workers issue, because it is one of the most important part of the general migrant labor topic. But and good luck with winter.
Yes, thanks.
So, okay, bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.